It's time now for the political analysis of Fromm and Fuller. Al Fromm, former political advisor to President Bill Clinton, and Craig Fuller, former political advisor to both Presidents Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush. Good morning, all. Craig, I'd like to start with you. Tuesday was a pretty good day for the Democrats. They did well in Kentucky with the governor's election. They did well in Virginia with the state legislators. And then you look at President Biden's polls. They've never been worse. They have never been worse in key battleground states. The recent polls showed him way behind former President Trump. What is going on?
It kind of reminds me of the opening of a great novel, which reads, "It was the best of times and is the worst of times." No question about it. Tuesday was a very good night for Democrats seeking election, as well as their message and ballot measures on abortion. Can't get beyond that. I mean, closest to home, I guess, is Virginia, where literally the election might have taken out of play one of the Republican supposed stars, Glenn Youngkin, governor of Virginia, who people were already talking about how if he could take hold of both houses, hold the House and flip the Senate, that he could, national politics was not long, would approach fairly quickly for him. Turns out he couldn't. He couldn't hold it. He couldn't hold one side, and he couldn't flip the other. He clearly it was a gambit. He clearly took a risk, but the messages just didn't work. And part of it was the abortion message. He had an approach that he said was reasonable, but I think one of the things I take from that is that the messenger is as important as the message. His approach may have been reasonable to some with regard to abortion, but the messenger is a Republican, and people just don't trust that the position is going to hold. Kentucky was also fascinating, where in a very red state that you have a governor who won by just a few thousand votes, comes back and wins quite overwhelmingly against a Republican candidate who's a strong candidate, supported, I heard, by 5 super PACs, including Senator McConnell's super PAC. He was a former McConnell staff person, but resoundingly defeated. And so a strong message there. And of course, Ohio with the ballot measure. But I guess one takeaway is something that Al and I have talked about, which is we spend a lot of time, and commentators spend a lot of time talking about the polls. It's good to see what happens when voters actually go to the polls. This ought to be, if like we needed it, a wake-up call to Republicans that you're not gonna win with some of the messaging we're engaged in, locked into some of the issues seem to be locked into, and strong candidates win. By the way, I thought the victory speech in Kentucky by Governor Beshear is one people ought to study. The shortest line, but one of the most impactful, was for somebody who's just won kind of overwhelmingly. He says, "We're not going to move to the left. We're not going to move to the right. We're going to move forward." This was a message that I think resonates pretty well with, especially that very large block of unaligned voters. So best of times, yes. Worst of times, as the Wall Street Journal said, Democrats are more confident about their campaign message than ever, and more nervous about their presidential candidate, incumbent President Joe Biden. The nervousness stems from the lack of approval in the polling. It's presumably tied to his age, because actually substantively you can't really be too negative. Not that my fellow Republicans don't try to be. And so you have to ask yourself, what's wrong here? And my sense is that you have people, when they're called by the pollsters, and I still think it's a challenge to sort out who gets called by pollsters, but when called, want to send a message, and the message is we don't really want the incumbent to run. We may, even if we love him, I saw one comment from a Democratic leader saying he was perfect. He was the perfect candidate in 2020, but he's not right now. And so I think that that's part of what's going on here. And the question is there an alternative? And I also think that, there may be a sense that Trump could weaken, although I'm not suggesting the polls suggest that, but could weaken with convictions and with added issues. And if that's the case, some of the candidates that we might talk about who were in the debate, Nikki Haley's my favorite, but could be quite formidable against a Biden candidacy, and I think that worries Democrats. So there's a lot of time to go. We got Iowa, and followed by New Hampshire, obviously, and a number of others. But right now, I think Democrats have a sense of what can drive them across the finish line successfully, and Republicans are going to have to regroup.
Al, it was an interesting contrast earlier this week. Even David Axelrod, President Obama's chief aide, was suggesting that Biden needed to reconsider whether he was going to run. How do you explain what we saw in the last couple of days?
I think that Democrats had a good night on Tuesday night. We showed once again, and this is, I think, the seventh election on this question, that abortion is a potent issue for Democrats, especially when it's put to the test alone. Most people side with the Democrats on that issue. We saw a moderate Democrat can win in a red state. I agree with Craig. I thought Andy Beshear's acceptance speech was the kind of message that a lot of candidates ought to listen to. But we also had low turnout. And so it's dangerous to read too much into it, because the people that didn't turn out were a lot of the people who are in the Trump base. A lot of working class white voters don't vote in these off-year elections. And when Trump's on the ballot, as opposed to being talked about, they tend to come out. So that can change the outcome of the election. There was also one warning sign for Democrats, and that was there was a city council race in the Bronx that for the first time in 40 years was won by a Republican, and it won on the crime issue. And if you remember in 2022, the reason the Republicans were in the House is because they won the House is because they won a number of seats in New York on the crime issue. So Democrats have to be a little bit leery about that. What I'd say about the polls, right now, this is an election. When people look at 2024, it's basically a referendum on Biden. And there's no doubt, you can't deny it. I mean, as Axelrod has said, people think Biden's old. I mean, Steve Beshear, or I'm sorry, that's his dad. Andy Beshear is, Steve Beshear is my old friend. Andy Beshear is 45, going to be 46 later this month. He's not 81. And in the polls, people basically question whether they think Biden is capable of doing the job. In the latest CNN poll, I think it was 73-24, who thought Biden didn't have the stamina and mental sharpness to serve as president. And I think a lot of it is they're looking not just at now, but by the end of his term, he'll be 86 years old. And so, that is a real problem. The other problem is, as Craig alluded to, for Biden, is that people think the country's moving on the wrong track, and it's overwhelming. It's about 3-1, wrong track, right track. So regardless of the fact that we've had almost 5% growth, I mean, I got a kick out of the Republican candidates in the debate. They're all talking about getting growth up to 3%. Well, it's 5% last quarter under Biden. But despite that, people just don't feel good. You know, inflation, crime, immigration. When they go to the grocery store, housing's now priced out of the market for most people. Gas prices aren't as high as they were at the peak, but they're still higher than they had been. And you just can't make people who don't feel good about the economy feel good by talking about it. That there is a path for Democrats. I think the other thing to consider in Kentucky is that it was a bright star on the Republican side who people thought was going to be a star of the future, and Trump endorsed him. How did that work out? Abortion, democracy are still going to be very potent issues, and that's how Biden is going to have to turn it around. As I look at the race coming up, Biden's challenge, and I think Trump will help him in meeting it actually, is to make this a referendum on Trump. You know, I mean, Trump is in the news, but he's not dominating the news the way he will in a campaign. People need to be reminded of the things they don't like about him. They need to see all those, they need to see every day, several times a day, those demented outbursts that we're seeing at the trial. They need to be reminded of the chaos that was in the White House, a second term agenda. I mean, one of the things that happens when you have polling way out, and one of the candidates is somebody who lost in a previous election, people tend to way out, think about the things they liked about him and not the things they didn't like. But as you get closer to the election, then with the advertising in a campaign, the things you don't like and you didn't like and the reasons you voted the guy out come more to the forefront. If Biden does that, if he can turn this election into a Trump, no Trump race, he can win, but to win, he needs to unify that anti-Biden vote. I mean, Trump's a really unique candidate. He has got a solid base. He's got a very high floor. He's going to get 40-45% no matter what. You know, he could be in the Birmingham jail and he'll still get 40-45%. But he also has a low ceiling. He can't get over 47% in a general election. So what that means is if the anti-Trump vote is consolidated, Biden can win. Biden's vote is very different than Trump's. Trump's vote is a pro-Trump vote. It's people who will fall on their sword for Trump no matter what. A lot of Biden's vote is people who don't like Trump. So he wins as the other guy. And that means that in a two-way race, he probably would win again. Mm. But in a three-way race, he's going to be in great trouble because if the anti-Trump vote is split, then Biden will have a hard time because Biden has a higher ceiling than Trump. In other words, he can get more than 50% as he did in 2020. But he has a much lower floor because so much of his vote is anti-Trump that if there's another anti-Trump alternative, that could fall away. The other thing that I think is really important is there's a lot going to happen in the next year. Trump's is going to be in court the whole time. Maybe he makes that an advantage. Biden's not going to get any younger. So in 6 months or a year, we may have a very different race. And as Craig has suggested, maybe even very different candidates.
You know, Craig, I can't remember who was talking about this, but one of the columnists was bringing up the fact that President Bush was dealing with a very unpopular Vice President, Dan Quayle. There was a lot of pressure for him to seek another running mate. He chose not to. He lost. Joe Biden is now facing the same kind of issue with Vice President Harris. We've talked about this in the past, where I think that many people are not finding her to be a suitable replacement. for Joe Biden. When could a candidate like Joe Biden say, I've got to change this?
You know, in my experience, people who hold the presidency have a very difficult time actually firing anybody, but especially their partner, the person elected by the people as their vice president. It's just a very steep hill to climb. I think I'd argue also that the Bush-Quayle situation was a little different in that Bush was probably by far the more popular one, and people just wanted to kind of add some energy to the ticket. Where in this case, it's Biden who has the problem. And maybe Kamala Harris polls poorly, but I don't know that just changing that would make the difference. And it's just very hard, and especially when you have a Californian, and you have someone who has some broad support in around the country where you need that support. The other thing I guess I would add, just take a moment to add, is that we tend to want to look, way down the runway to November. But when it comes to the sorting out of Republicans and maybe with Democrats, the runway really is shorter for some of this, and it gets to the kind of the question you asked, because Republicans will go through Iowa, very conservative. A lot of people have won in Iowa. Pat Robertson, for example, who never got close to being president, so it's not in any way determinative. But it's a sorting out process. And then New Hampshire, a very different kind of state. I think Nikki Haley plays stronger there than DeSantis does. And the thing about Trump, and maybe it's engaging in wishful thinking, but the thing about Trump is that he looks at these national polls. But it's been a while since I've tromped around Iowa and New Hampshire. But one thing I know about both of those states, and that is they want candidates to show up. They want to physically see them 4, 5, 6 times. It's not like big urban areas. And so when I looked at the Republican debate last night, a lot of people say, well, Trump came in first because he didn't show up. I think he came in last. He went to some arena where he says publicly, I'm speaking to tens of thousands of people here tonight in the arena. Well, the place only held 5,000 people, and there were a lot of empty seats. And he didn't show up. And in terms of the perception in Iowa and New Hampshire, it's just another example of somebody who's not engaging this. And I think eventually, as one or two of these Republicans begins to be a real alternative, by the time you get to New Hampshire, and then don't forget South Carolina, where Nikki Haley is from, the support for Trump, it's hard for me to see, and Al gave a very accurate description of it. It's hard for me to see Trump building that base. And in fact, you get the governor of Iowa, you get elected official in Iowa coming out for DeSantis because she says Trump can't win. So it seems to me that it's going to erode. And Biden faces a similar problem. If he gets to the end of the year, earlier in the year, and this problem's great as it is, changing his vice president won't help. It's going to have to be a change at the top of the ticket.
Al, you have the last word this week.
Well, I think that Kamala Harris is a conundrum for Biden. I don't think he would change. Biden's issues are age and whether he's up to the job. It means, I'm sure, that the Republicans in the campaign are going to focus more on Kamala Harris. They're going to say, are we really electing President Harris? And she's not very popular. In in those swing states, in the New York Times Siena University poll, she was a point or two better than Biden in the matchups with Trump. But basically, most places she seems to be weaker than Biden even. Biden also needs to consolidate the Democratic Party. And what those polls have showed is that he is running way behind where he did in 2020 among young voters, among Black voters, among Hispanic voters, particularly working class Hispanics and Black males. Kamala Harris is important to all of those constituencies. And just in the nominating process, the most important constituencies in the Democratic Party are African Americans and white women, liberal women. And you can't win a nomination if you don't have support of both. Now, Biden, I don't think, is in danger of losing the nomination, but he could lose substantial support among those constituencies. And those constituencies are what Kamala Harris represents. So he needs her to be strong through the primaries. And so I don't think there's any likelihood that he's not going to, that he would change vice president.
Well, we have to leave it there. Al Fromm, Craig Fuller, thank you so much indeed. We will see you next week.